Welcome to the Executive Function Brain Trainer Podcast. I'm Dr. Erica Warren.
And I'm Darius Namdaran, and we're your hosts. Sponsored by Ivy. Imagine turning your meeting's audio into a live mind map instantly so you remember what matters. Well, try Ivy for free now at ivy.app. That's IVVI.app.
Sponsored by GoodSensoryLearning.com, engaging remedial materials that bring delight to learning. Hey, Darius, nice to see you.
Hey, Erica, nice to see you too.
So, what have we got going for today?
Well, I came across this phrase called flare and focus, and I think it's a fascinating phraseology, and it's got a lot to do. We can learn a lot from executive functions from it. Flare and focus is predominantly used within design thinking. A lot of designers use it, developers use it, and basically flare means they flare out their thinking and then they focus in their thinking. So there's two different kinds of thinking. And I just want to talk about these two words, and they're just such useful words. And if we can stitch them into executive functions, you can see where they weave into the executive functions more explicitly, because a lot of people are using flare and focus within unconsciously doing executive functions with it. So I just wanted to unpack and make it more intentional.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it reminds me a lot of how I often talk about opening and closing your aperture. But it also reminds me of whether you're zooming in or zooming out. Mind maps allow you to see the big picture, which where you're zooming out or where you're zooming in. So this is going to be fun.
Yeah, so let's just kind of start with how do we define flare and focus? Okay. So basically, if you think about flare as starting from a point and then flaring out, like flares on your trousers or a fan fanning out. Okay. So basically, if you think about your thinking fanning out, a wide angled lens with a wide aperture, like you see, you're seeing the big picture, and this really relates to the ability to brainstorm, to be cognitively flexible, to ideate, and things like that. Then you've got focus, which is the ability to prioritize, the ability to organize, the ability to sort of mute out less important things and amplify important things and follow through on something. And this really relates to working memory, inhibitory control, and time management. So you've got both of these aspects happening within everyone all the time, and you just emphasize one or the other.
It's funny, it makes me think of the universe. Like flare is almost like the Big Bang, right? So the
Yes.
universe is constantly moving out, whereas
Yes.
this is where you're looking at one specific star, one specific planet.
So I think it's really nice to kind of, so you meet certain people who are just always in flare mode. They're always big picture, they're always firing out different ideas. And then you'll meet other people who are always in focus mode. They're like, right, how do we drill this down to the next achievable step? And how do we take action on this? And let's turn this into a plan and take action. And you need both. And so let's look at the strengths of flare and focus. A lot with minds that flare very naturally are very divergent thinkers. They're often the problem solvers, the innovators, the entrepreneurs. They often have dyslexia, ADHD. They co-occur so often, these entrepreneurs with dyslexia and ADHD, so on. But this flare type thinking is not exclusive to them, but very much this divergent thinking.
I think a nice way to think about it is, when people think of attention deficit, it's such a misnomer. It's
Yes.
really attention surplus, which is more in line with flare. They're able to absorb more. I mean, and that's why they have a hard time focusing, right? Because
Yeah.
they're absorbing so much and
Yeah.
they're aware of so much. I wish they would change the name because it gives you it's really the wrong impression of what it is. It's really attention
Yeah.
surplus.
attention surplus and focus deficit. I suppose instead of
Right.
attention deficit disorder, it's focus deficit disorder. It's not actually attention deficit. It's they've got a huge amount of attention. It's just spread out
That's right.
widely.
They're experts at flair.
Yes.
They're just not
Yes.
very good at focus
Yes. Yes.
unless they're in a flow.
Yeah, unless they hyperfixate and then they really go into focus. So they're flaring out, they snag on something that really catches their attention, and then they go into hyperfocus. And so you've got flare and focus happening within ADHD. You've got flare and focus happening within creativity. For example, the British
Yes.
Design Association talks about their industry standard for how to understand the creative process is called the double diamond design process. Have you heard of the double diamond design
I
process?
have, but tell us about it.
So, like the double diamond design process is like you flare out to capture your ideas and then you focus in, and that's your first diamond. And then from the end of that diamond, you flare out again and then you focus back in. So you've got double diamond. And the power of a double flare and a double focus is that, when you're ideating, we think the answer is in this general idea in this general area. You might ideate about your ideal customer avatar, etc., who your user might be. You then narrow that down to, oh, we've got 20 different possibilities. Let's narrow it down to two or three, or maybe even one. And then once you've nailed that one, you then go and experiment on that and flare out from that. And then you focus back in from there. And so, actually, if you were to draw the diamonds on a route map on a map, they wouldn't be going in a straight line. One would be going in one direction, focusing, and then it would change direction and it would be a double diamond. And you'd kind of zigzag to your end destination, but you'd get there faster rather than the big, long, winding ramble. And that's the double diamond design and this flare and focus. Actually, I should give credit. Who was the chap that does V-Note that you introduced me to?
Nick Kojnik.
Nick Kojnik introduced this to me as a chat. He just took it as common parlance from one of the people that he had met with dyslexia about flaring and focusing. And it's just quite a nice parlance where you're just saying, oh, I'm just going to flare for a moment. It's a bit of,
I
jargon, but
love that. I love that. I mean, and by saying that, you're preparing somebody and you're also building some degree of compassion and you're kind of saying, hey, all right, I'm warning you.
yes,
I'm warning you. I'm gonna flare. And so then the person's ready, right? Because if they're in focus mode and you're flaring and you don't really give them a heads up, you can go awry on your conversation where there can be some degree of frustration where one person wants to focus and the other person wants to flare.
yes. And actually, this is the beauty about human beings and life and working together is that we complement one another. And you need these to work in partnership with each other. You need to flare out and then you need to focus down. You can't be flaring all the time, otherwise, you never get anything done. You can't be focusing all the time, otherwise, you get to a certain point and you miss opportunities. Okay. Oh, I've got a lovely story about missing opportunities about honeybees. Okay. And it kind of ties into flare and focus a bit here. Okay. I used to be a beekeeper. I love honeybee stories. Okay. And I don't know if you know that honeybees tell each other where the honey is, well, the nectar is and the pollen. I'll just call it honey for simplicity. They tell the bees where the honey is by a waggle dance. Did you know that?
Oh, waggle dance.
A
Oh,
waggle dance. Have
oh,
you
do
heard of the
tell.
waggle dance?
I have not.
Well, it's amazing because if you take a honeycomb out of the hive, you will see bees just wandering around doing their thing. And then you'll see some bees waggling quite energetically in the middle of on the honeycomb. Okay. And what scientists have done is they've worked out that what the bees are doing is they are giving directions to the other bees as to where they got the honey from.
Wow.
Yes.
That
Wow, it's
brings a
amazing.
whole new it just kind of blew my mind in the sense of how could they possibly communicate spatial skills, a spatial like a map through a waggle.
Yeah, so what they do, the way they do it is the top of the hive, vertical, points to the sun, okay?
Mhm.
So they orient everything to the sun, okay? So they've just come back. The sun is in a fixed point in the sky. It's moving a little bit, but not enough for the short time. The bee says, right, you waggle, waggle, waggle. So it does like three waggles and moves three body lengths forward, which is a unit of measure in bees. So that will be like 300 meters that way. And then it'll turn to the left and it'll start saying, then you need to go 200 meters this way. And then you need to go this way. And it'll show a route along, roads and down a river, and then there will be a junction that will be a big tree, and then that will be a shift in direction. So they're basically communicating through the waggles how to get to the
Spatial waggles.
absolutely. And depending on the vigorousness of the bee waggle, shows how good a store it is. So if they're kind of like, yeah, yeah, it's kind of like average, one bee will listen to another one bee doing a waggle dance, and there'll be another bee doing another waggle dance to the other side of it. And it'll decide, actually, this is the one I'm going to go for because they're more enthusiastic. And they'll copy that bee and they will follow the route exactly to where the nectar is,
Oh,
and
that's
they'll bring it back.
fascinating. So they copy the bee so that they get the map kind of ingrained into
Yes.
their body
Yeah, yeah.
through movement.
Yeah.
It's a kinesthetic memory.
Absolutely. They feel it. Yeah.
So it's
And
a
then they get,
visual, then kinesthetic.
well, it's completely kinesthetic because they feel it. They feel the orientation accorded because it's dark. It's dark inside of the hive. It's black, you know, 37 degrees centigrade and black. And so they
So
just
they
feel,
can't see it all? Then how
no,
do they know that how do they know that the bee's changing direction?
they feel it because the bee rubs up against them and they push all
Oh
the
my
bees that way and they feel it.
goodness.
Yeah. And they can feel it on the honeycomb as well. Anyway, so they've done the waggle dance and they've gone and flown and they've got the nectar and they come back and then they do the waggle dance and they pass it on to the next person, the next bee. Okay. Now, if the bees, this is where the flare and focus comes in. Okay. If you're a typical honeybee, you'll do exactly how you're described it. Okay, 80+% of bees will just follow what bee has just told them to do, and they'll go and get the nectar. They're so well organized. They don't just randomly go out because it uses up a lot of energy to fly somewhere, which is nectar, to get more nectar and bring it back. So there's a price to be paid to get the nectar. They have to use nectar to get nectar. And so they don't want to waste it. Okay. I mean, these bees use a lot of energy. So they're very efficient. Now, if they were super efficient, you would think that 100% of bees would follow where the directions are to the honey. Okay. But if they did that and they really focused, everyone focused on the waggle dance. This is the difference between focus and flare. If they all did that, they'd all finish the nectar in that patch of ivy or whatever it is. And then they fly back and they not know where to go next because everyone's telling them to go to the one place. So what the bees have done is about 10 to 15% of them don't follow the waggle dance. They go their own way and they find honey by accident. And then when they find it, let's say 1 in 10 finds it, they get a new haul, they come back, they do the waggle dance really excitedly because there's tons. And then all the other bees start going to this new site.
So no, it's not honey, it's pollen, right?
It's nectar and pollen.
Nectar,
Yeah, yeah,
nectar and pollen. So I guess there are those that are flaring out to find new
that's right.
places, and then
Yes,
those that are focusing in that are because they can be more direct. They're not
yes,
wasting. Uh,
yes.
why can't human beings be this efficient and work together this way? I mean,
Well,
it's just
well, the thing is, we are this efficient in many ways. If you think about this, I have
mm,
a theory,
yeah.
right? Okay, I researched this a bit. So scientists have gone in and tried to figure out why some bees follow the waggle dance and some don't. Okay, there's a lot of research on bees. And what they've concluded is that some bees follow the waggle dance, okay, but they misread. They can't, they're like dyslexic bees. They read the message wrong, okay? And so they go the
They
wrong
take a
route.
left instead of a right.
Yeah, that's right. So often, very young bees who haven't quite learned how to interpret the waggle dance go out there, start following it, and then they go the wrong way and they find something new and they come back and do the waggle dance to where they actually went. So actually, I think there's a genetic reason why people have a disposition to be dyslexic or ADHD or whatever, and we think of these as problems. They're not problems. They're just different ways of thinking, and that there's a role for that different way of thinking. Like there's a role for these bees that don't follow the directions, they flare out. And so often there are certain people who have a tendency to flare out, and there's certain people who have a tendency to focus. And when they work with one another, you get the great harvest. It's like some people are hunters and some people are gatherers. So these people who are much wider angled thinkers, big picture thinkers, they're doing this scanning of the horizon, hunting for signals of prey, of opportunity, of and so on. They go
Mm,
find it, but they're not necessarily very good at gathering it all. So they come back
right.
and they tell the tribe, look, I just found this great. Why don't we all go out there and get it? And they're like, fantastic. They
You
might be
guys go
short.
get it, and I'll find the next one.
That's right. So it's like some people are like long-sighted and some people are short-sighted. And if you were long-sighted in the savannah, you could spot things in the distance. It's like, great, you go spot it. I'm short-sighted. I'll go right up to the animal and process it and skin the hide and all the rest of it, etc. And according to your abilities.
What I love about this discussion is we're often talking about executive functions as kind of it's your own executive functions. And this is almost executive functions working as a team.
Yes.
So when you start to combine flair and focus, there's more of a societal benefit versus an individual benefit. It's about collective benefits. That's something kind of lovely because we haven't really talked about the collective benefits of executive functioning diversity. And there's something really beautiful about that. I just love the term neurodiversity because it really does take the stigma out of so many of these disabilities. And so many of these disabilities really do have these unique ways of processing and looking at things that have value.
Yes. Yeah, I think even thinking about short-sightedness and long-sightedness, historically, people have been short-sighted and long-sighted. And I remember when I was really young, my grandpa would tell me to look out the window at the boats and read the names of the front of boats in the sea. And had really good long sight, and he didn't. But he had a great deal of wisdom about each one of the boats coming in, and he knew them by name and so on. And so there's young and old working in partnership. There's long-sighted and short-sighted working in partnership. Likewise, we do that in all sorts of different abilities. So let's look at some of the challenges of flare and focus. I mean, one of the things is with flaring is I see this sometimes with certain people that I know with dyslexia or often with ADHD, is you can be so wide a thinker that you want to keep your options open all the time.
Right. You can get stuck in the flare, in the
Yeah.
expansion.
Yeah, and you're just expanding, expanding, and you feel I've got to keep, I've got to, and often I see this often with dyslexia. It's a common trait when it comes to answering a question. Okay, so if you write a question down, an essay question, and you ask them, "What do you think this essay question is asking you?" They will have such a flare of an idea and expand the scope of the question so much that they'll feel overwhelmed by it. And you're like, no, 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 that's not what they were asking. They weren't asking you to explain every single Renaissance painter in history in a 2,000 word essay. No, they were asking you to choose two Renaissance painters and compare them. Ah, okay. I was thinking about the 100 that I know about. And you're like, no, 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 let's ease this down. And that's where this flare and focus comes in. So sometimes you can flare out so much that you get overwhelmed And
Right.
you just say, "I'm just not gonna do this. I can't do this. This is too much for me." And it's true. It is too much for anyone if you flare it out that much, but that's not
Right.
what was being asked.
Right, 'cause I see so many kids, they get the question, but they then take a little diversion and another little diversion
Yes.
off of that, another little
Yes.
diversion off of that, and then all of a sudden, when they're done, I say, "Go back and read the question, did you answer it?" "Oh, I started to."
Yes.
And then I went down this rabbit hole, and then
Yes.
that rabbit hole, and then that rabbit hole. And that's, I suppose, flaring can lead to a lot of rabbit holes.
Absolutely. And, in the workplace, you would call it expanding the scope.
Well, it's funny because in a way, if you are going down a rabbit hole, you are focusing to some degree,
Yeah, you are. Yes,
but
you
it's
are
a
focusing, but
diversion. It's a
yes,
diversion off the path, so to
that's
so
right. Yeah, yeah. I think that's the nature of focusing is you are hyper focusing maybe, or you're focusing on one particular thing or a number of different threads. But the nature of focusing compared to flare is that you're intentionally using inhibitory control to say, no, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm not going to do that. No, 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 yes. And during the flare, it's like brainstorming. Yes, 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 yes. Oh, and this. It's like improvisation. You know, we went down the river and you fell in the water. Oh, yes, I fell in the water and then I caught a crocodile by the tail. Oh, yes, you did the crocodile, but the crocodile had a hippopotamus in its mouth. Oh, yes. And it's the improvisation kind of rule of yes, and, that's kind of like the flare mode. But then the focus mode is the no, no.
it's so funny because I can be very focused, and I usually am, but I never have to say no. I just am focused. But I
Well,
think there are those people that do have to consciously say no.
you have to say no. And if you're thinking about it as a creative process, okay, you're basic. If it was probably the easiest way to understand it. Here are a bunch of different opportunities for us. All of them are reasonably quite good. So let's say the honeybee example. There are 10 different locations, but if we rank them, that's a 3, that's a 5, that's a 6, that's a 7, and that's a 9. What am I going for? I can only go one place. I'm going to the 9. Okay. So you just listen to the instructions on the 9, you go to the 9, you come back, you listen again, etc. And that's the nature of focusing is kind of being very goal focused, very target focused. It's this complete focus on your chosen priority.
So what are the challenges of focus?
Well, I think the challenge of focus is you can spend too much time on that task.
Right, you lose the big picture.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I was meant to go and get honey, And you get honey and you get honey and you get honey. And then you say to the honeybee, can you fly back? And you're like, oh no, I've got too much honey. I've got too much nectar. I'm too way down. I can't fly back. So the honeybee's got to weigh up. They've got to get enough honey to make it worth their while to have made the trip, plus a bit extra. So they've got more to give back to the hive, but they can't take too much because then they can't fly back. So they got to weigh up what's the optimum payload. And in a way, that's part of the focus. It's like you can expand the scope too much, or you can be a perfectionist where you're like, oh no, I've got to do it exactly right. Oh, this is not perfect yet. This is not perfect. And that's part of this double diamond design.
Interesting, bringing perfection into it. That's very
Yes.
the perfectionistic quality of being too hyper focused and just
Yes.
not letting it go. And one of my favorite sayings is a work of art is never finished, it's merely abandoned. And I see that with my artwork, my pottery, with my writing. You can always spend more time working on it, but it's interesting. Sometimes you work on it so much that it's completely different. It's like you could have almost written 2 blogs, 2 completely different blogs, and you can
Yes.
keep massaging something until it is just yeah.
I think that's where how Brené Brown talks about shame and also the shitty first draft. Have you heard
I
of her shitty first draft?
I have not heard about that one.
Yeah, it's a bit rude, sorry, but that's her terminology, okay? And basically what she says is every first thing that you do, book, blog, podcast, whatever, there's always a shitty first draft. And you've got to allow yourself to do that first draft, okay? And technically in the British double diamond, that's the first diamond. And the
Interesting.
second diamond is where the gold is. Okay. So the first flare and then the first focus is not the end of the matter. And if you're a perfectionist, you'll want to flare out and focus and have the job done. But actually, it's an iterative process. You flared out, you focused, and you think, this is pretty good. I was nearly there, but I'm going to flare out a bit more just to see if there's a few things that I kind of missed on this. And then I'll focus in with what I've learned, and then you hit the mark.
You know what I love about this is this could be such a fun tool to teach kids. Really teaching them what flaring is and really teaching them what focus is because there's something a little playful about it. And for a teacher to be able to say like, "Oh, this is a really great first draft and I'm curious. Let's flare for a minute." Right? How could we make this better? Let's go into a flare. Or let's go into a focus here. Let's
Yeah.
focus on this one part of your essay. How can we make that better? And teaching them that lingo because there's something really kind of lovely about that.
Yes, absolutely. I love the terminology. It's new to me. I mean, we would call it divergent thinking and convergent thinking would be the technical terms, you know?
Sure.
Yeah, you
Sure.
wouldn't say that to someone. Let's do some divergent thinking here. Let's do some
Right.
convergent thinking. But flare and focus really nails it on the head.
Yeah. Or sometimes I'll say, let's open your aperture or let's close your aperture. You
Yes.
know, or we've often used the analogy of the blinkers. Blinkers meaning that that's what's it's called when we put those kind of leather, what do you call them? They
Blinkers.
restrict, right? But I don't think many Americans use that term, but they restrict the eyesight of a horse.
That's right. Yeah, it's like a cap, but instead of on the top of your head, it's on each side of the eyes. So you're looking forwards and only look at what's
Right, and you're
ahead of
not
you.
distracted by what's
Yeah.
on the sides.
If you strap two caps to the sides of your face, and that would be what it would be like for the horse. Yes.
Right, right. It's like a little it's tunnel vision in a
Tunnel
sense.
vision, absolutely. And do you know what? It's interesting. I've been wearing a cap recently a lot more, and because I find it makes me be just a little bit more focused.
Isn't that well, and of course it is. It's focusing your vision because it's
That's
blocking
right.
off some
Yeah,
things.
that's right.
And vision is probably our biggest sensory input.
Yeah.
Oh, so what I'm curious about is how can we balance flare and focus? Because I think so many of these things, it really is a balance. It's a balance of finding people that perhaps work with you that balance you, but finding balance within yourself. And I think that there are times where I need to say to myself, wow, I've really got a flare. And other times where I've got to say, hey, wait a minute, I need to focus.
I think our society is more on the side of focus. Focus, 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 focus.
Education,
Yes.
education absolutely is,
Yeah.
and
And even
probably workplace is,
and workplace,
although it depends on what profession you're in. Because I can think of some professions where it's all about flair. Like if you're working in an airport and you're keeping track of all of the traffic coming in and out, they have to stay in perpetual flair.
maybe. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah.
guess it really, but that's the interesting thing is that if your default is flair, then what you want to do is you want to find a profession that really allows you to flare. And if you are perpetually focusing, finding a profession that honors that, it kind of bums me out that education can't spend more time honoring those that flare
Yeah,
because
yeah.
there's really something to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. First of all, your question was how can we find a balance? Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think first of all, it's self-awareness. where you say, I tend to flare or I tend to focus. So that's see which is your default. Maybe some self-awareness as to I tend to flare more at night or I tend to focus more in the morning, so it could be time specific. Then once you know a little bit more about yourself and are a little bit more conscious of that, you start looking for intentional relationships where you can flare. Okay, so your relationship with a person or with art or a creative relationship, you allow that flare opportunity. I mean, for example, today with the developer and Ivy, as you know, we're developing Ivy, a piece of software. I said to him, look, over the holidays, we're both going to be working, but we need to create a hackathon. Okay. One day we're just going to play. We're not going to have any targets or anything like that. We're just going to come together. We're going to be on Zoom together for 8 hours. And we're going to try and create a little micro plugin for Google Chrome to do with Ivy. Okay. We're just going to have fun. And in doing it, we'll learn lots about using AI. AI, the two of us, and a little project, we'll just do it together. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, no problems. It's just a learning, fun experience. That's really a flair experience, isn't it? And it's playful and fun. Whereas the rest of the time, often we're like, right, we've got to focus. Let's do our sprint plan. Let's work out, prioritize what our key ideas are, etc. Let's time them. Let's give ourselves an allocation of resources, etc. It's quite structured and systematic. So I think if you know who you can flare with, that's another thing. And then also
Mm.
balance it with another person who's willing to be your focus and who needs someone to flare with, and balance. Or maybe you just need to be around lots of other people who are brainstorming all the time, very artistic in art school or whatever, and they're just flaring left, right, and center, and you're setting each other off on fire, which is great. So there's a lot of what places do you put yourself in? And
I,
then there's other things as well, but I'll stop there because I could keep going.
I'm also thinking that if you have a personal flair and a personal focus, it's very different than when you have it with somebody, because what somebody else helps you to do that you can't necessarily do yourself is pivot. So to me, there's another piece when you work with a person. There's focus, flair, and pivot. Pivot would be them getting you to kind of shift your whole perspective. So if you think of yourself as on looking at the horizon and the beach, and you can focus and you can flare on the horizon, but someone can get you to pivot and turn around and look at the other side. So now you're not maybe looking at the sunset, you're looking at just the clouds that are lit
The
up by the sun, and you
the moonrise. Often when the
it
sun's
could
setting
be.
in Scotland, the moon's rising behind you.
There you go. It's the moonrise, which is a complete pivot, which is different. But I find that I suppose anybody can, as a person, they can focus and they can flare, but it's harder to pivot. But when you're with other people, you're kind of getting a combination of focus, flare, and pivot. And the pivot is allowing you to look at things from a completely different perspective, or just kind of like just shifting, turning, and looking in a different direction, which can be really, it makes me think of cognitive flexibility. I
Absolutely.
feel like focus and flare is more of working memory and inhibitory control, and the pivot, which is a harder thing to do individually, but you can, because you can say, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to
Yeah.
look the other direction. I'm going to take a different perspective. I'm going to let go of my perspective and imagine what it must be like to have the perspective of this person or this thing. But I do love the idea of how when you're working with others and collaboration and cooperation, how it brings in more pivoting than usual. I don't know. It's kind of bringing in a whole new dynamic.
If you think about the double diamond design, okay, and you've got one diamond
Right.
joined to another diamond, and
There's
that's the
pivot in
pivot
there.
point.
That's the pivot. Ooh,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah.
The pivot point.
Yes. And it's like a hinge. And I think that's
Right.
that's why it's so important when you see that diamond design and it looks like a bridge where you've got two
Oh,
arches, it's not going in one direction. It's not going in a straight line. It pivots at that point.
it's lovely because it makes me think that in those moments where after you flared and you brought it into a focus, it's an opportunity for you to say, do I need to pivot or not? It's like a pivot point within
Yes,
that sequence, which is kind of because, right, you don't want to really pivot in the middle of a flare or in the middle of a focus. You want to pivot at either the beginning or the end.
absolutely. You're right. Absolutely.
There's
Yes.
something really lovely about that. There's a really good executive functioning hack there.
Yes, yes. And it's quite a nice sequence, because the sequence is honeybee goes out, sees 7 different options of potential places to go, the flare, then makes a decision. I'm going for the number 9 because it's got the most wiggle. And it goes to that one, and then it comes back and it decides, do I go back out to that or do I
Pivot.
readjust it pivot from that point? And obviously it's coming back to the hive, so it doesn't use the image so well. It's kind of like once you're at that point, but we're constantly leapfrogging back, forward, and it's this iterative cycle from flare, focus to pivot. I like it.
Yeah, and what I feel in my system is I think of students, right? So if a student is going to be most effective in getting their homework done, right? You flare out and say, okay, what am I going to do next? You focus in on one assignment and you stay focused on that one assignment. You unitask. So a student that wants to do homework, they have to flare out to say, okay, what am I going to do? And then they focus in on one assignment. And it's so important. And this is something that we've talked about quite a lot is how important it is to unitask and not multitask. So staying focused on one task, then you finish that task. That's your opportunity to pivot. You flare out again, pivot. I guess you really pivot, flare out
Yeah.
again. What do I have to do for this particular assignment? Then you focus and you get things done. But yeah, the chronic problem that I see in so many of my students is that they're multitasking. I watch my students, they're working on a paper and they've got all of these notifications going off at once and they go down that little rabbit hole and that little rabbit hole and then they come back, but they're just not fully present.
They're not in the flow. And there's
They're, they,
something beautiful about being in the
that's
flow.
it. That's it. You lose the flow when you don't honor the focus.
I suppose in a way what we've talked about is when you're in flare mode, just be in flare mode. When you're in focus mode, just be in focus mode. When you're in pivot mode, be in pivot mode. And in a way, I think of these 3 phases of executive function as filter, focus, adapt. Filtering is working memory. Focus is inhibitory control. And then adapting is cognitive flexibility. So in effect, the filter phase is like, in a way, like a filter is very wide and broad. You're just trying to capture a huge net of information and filter it down to what you think is the most important. And then you focus and then you adapt. It's a loose connection with the process of filter, focus, and adapt.
Well, it's interesting. You have, or you could even combine and say, go with the 3 Fs of filter, focus, and flare.
Oh, actually, no. Flare, no. Filter, I'm replacing flare with filter. So flare, focus, and what would be another word for
Well, it's
adapt?
interesting. Well, I would think of filter as being more like focusing because you're filtering out the flare.
Yes, it is, but I actually,
We'll have to explore that sometime. You and I will have to
yeah,
explore because I think that they could work well together, filter,
it-
focus, and flare.
yeah.
Yeah, I see how they do overlap.
So the
What's so
filtering is
interesting, go ahead.
the filtering is more, when you've got a really wide angled lens and you're scanning something, you're kind of filtering the default horizon of things to look for the opportunity, the animal moving, the opportunity on the horizon. Oh, there's a movement there. There's a movement there. and you're kind of filtering everything out to try and find those things. And then you go, there are three opportunities here. That's just a tree moving. That I think is actually a deer. And I'm going to go, and then you focus in and you go running towards the deer or stalking towards the deer. So this filtering process is part of the flare in my kind of imagination of it.
So then it's really flare, filter, focus.
Ah, yes, that's it.
It's flare,
Yes,
filter, focus. Oh my God, it's a tongue twister. Flare, filter, focus. And
that's
if you
it.
can
Exactly.
maintain that and stay in that, you're in a flow. Flow equals
Oh,
flare, filter, and then focus.
yeah. And those are the three component parts of staying in flow.
That was really satisfying.
That was good. Nice one. Nice one. That was really nice. Yes.
Well,
Hey, do you
maybe
know what I just discovered this week is something I think I just discovered something quite important for me and I think for others that I work with. I think people with dyslexia and processing difficulties often fall out of flow more often than others because they're doing multiple processes at once. Okay. And I've seen this. For example, I've been working with an executive and showing him how to do some executive function coaching on task management. Okay. And so he's just typing in his tasks on a list. Okay. So he's focusing in on emptying his mind and just doing a brain dump of all the things that are in his mind to empty his mind. Okay. We've all done it. It's super important to do. It needs to be part of our workflow. Okay. But here's what I noticed was happening. He's typing away his task. He's thinking about the task that's on his mind. And then there's a spelling mistake. So he goes back and corrects the spelling
ah,
mistake.
and he loses his flow.
Yes.
Yes,
Now,
you're absolutely right. And I'll tell you why. Because dyslexic skills, the core skills aren't built to automaticity.
exactly.
Things like a spelling mistake or even if you're a typist and you are not a touch typer, that can get in the way of flow
Yes,
as well. Or if you are not really an automatic reader where you're still decoding words. I mean, and of course, all of these things take up cognitive space too. So it's a
yes,
combination of it not being automatic and it taking up cognitive space, which disrupts the flow.
it does. And really, we say you should only do one thing at a time. Okay.
Mm.
Now, on the outside, for this person, they were doing only one thing at a time.
Yes,
Okay.
poor things. Yes.
But they were doing two processes at a time, consciously doing two processes at a time.
Well, they were
So,
fine until they had a misspelling, right?
yes, absolutely. So that
They get derailed.
to be more accurate, we should do one process at a time. Not one thing, but one process. Like this flare, that filter, and that focus, you should be doing one of these at a time, not all of them at the same time. Just like when he was typing in, so I said to him, look, you've got to stop a minute. Do you care if that word is spelt right on your own personal to-do list? And he says, no. And I said, well, why are you correcting it then? And he's like, oh gosh, good point. And I said, well, stay in the flow. Don't correct any spelling mistakes at all. Empty your brain out. And then if you
Fine.
want, go back and correct the spelling and do one process at a time. And that's the
Yes.
key. You do one process at a time. And and it's like, now, don't get me wrong, if you're listening to this, you might think, well, that doesn't make sense because looking at typing in a to-do list, there's actually about five processes involved in there, you know? But what I'm talking about is one conscious process and everything else is on automatic, like you were saying, Erica. So if you can spell automatically, great. If you can type automatically, great. If you can decode the words yourself, great. But if you find it hard to read, or if you find it hard to spell, if you find it hard to type, whatever, you should be doing one process at a time in order to stay in the flow. And that's the joy of it. My wife, finally, sorry, Erica, my wife was saying people who talk about flow is they say that you should do a task that you're comfortable doing and has 5% uncertainty to it. And then you can stay in the flow. So it's stretching you by about 5%, but you're 95% in it and confident on it. And then you stretch by 5% and you can really stay in the flow. When you're doing multiple processes, that's often you're like, oh, I'm not good at this. Oh, I'm not good at that. Oh, I'm not good at this. And you're constantly destabilizing the boat, as it were. So you can't stay in the flow and stay stable on the boat in the river.
And what you have to be most aware of is what helps you to maintain your flow. So, for example, if you're writing a paper and spelling gets in the way of your flow, is there another way to write your paper? Can you use speech to text, which
Yes.
enables you on Google Docs? You can use voice typing and you
Yeah.
can just speak it,
Yeah.
but just speak it. Don't get too caught up in how it sounds or anything like that. Just get it out. And that's one of the great things about using AI is you can just get it out and then
Yeah.
it organizes it for you, which
Yes.
is
Absolutely.
which is so satisfying. But yes, I think what's most important is, and teachers struggle with this because they tend to teach the way that they learn. Oh, well,
Yeah.
well, that worked for me, so I'll teach them
Yes.
this strategy. But
Yes.
helping students to figure out what's their way of processing. I'll have parents say to me, well, Susie can't listen to an audiobook. That's not reading. And I always say, yes, it is. It's reading with your ears. It's not reading with your eyes. Maybe that's not the way that you process, but that's the way Susie processes. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's everything right with that. And giving people the the ability to choose what works for them and celebrate that and not make them feel like it's cheating or that it's wrong
Yes.
or that it's unfair. It's whatever helps someone to process the information is what's best for them.
So, completing this circle of flair and focus, can you see why I was so pleased about these words?
Yeah, it's really fun.
And I think let's have a quick look at some of the tools and then finish this off with some tools.
Yeah.
Like my favorite tool to work with flair and focus is mind mapping. So if you look at mind mapping, it's a real flair tool. A lot of people use mind mapping to brainstorm a spider diagram. If you don't know what mind mapping is, it's basically a keyword in the center of the page, and then you do branches off it with keywords on top of it, on top of each branch, and then you branches off that, and it becomes like a tree of information, and you start to see the patterns and hierarchy of the information. That's kind of like a flair, but a lot of
Well, it's more than a flare.
okay.
Initially, it's a flare, then it's a filter,
Yes,
then
that's
it's
where
a focus. It's
it is.
exactly what we were talking about.
Yes,
It's the
yes,
flare, filter, focus.
that's
It
right.
enables you, it walks you through and documents the pathway. It allows you to see the big picture. And then you
Yeah,
can take any one of those little pathways and filter and focus so you get into flow.
that's right. Absolutely. I just take the example of writing a story, for example. Okay.
Yeah.
So a child writing a story. I've got this beautiful story, Evie, who's in Ireland. She's a great storyteller. She won a storytelling competition. Okay. And she ended up writing this book and publishing it on Amazon. And she was like 12 years old. And she did my course on writing stories with a mind map, with a story star. And basically what she did was she tended to flare and have way too many characters, way too many things happen in a story. Everything got lost and it never came to an ending. Okay. And we all know what that's like. That's pure flair. Okay. But you need that flair. So you mind map that all out. And then the next thing is it becomes like a fruit tree where you prune the branches and you kind of a bonsai tree, you kind of bonsai it and you go, do we need 7 friends for the main character? No, let's go for one or two. and you're like, okay, we'll get rid of this, and you prune that away, filtering, and and then there's like a few branches. You might end up with 10 branches, and you decide, do we need 10 steps in this story? Let's think about the five main stages of a story. Oh, I'm missing this, I'm missing that, and you can start seeing a pattern, in that sort of flare stage, and then you hone it down and you delete, 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 delete. And that's one of the most important things in a mind map, actually, is to delete and delete and delete as much as you possibly can. So it can seem actually very childlike and simple after an intense process, rather than a big, complicated, hundreds of words or 50 or 100 word map with 4 levels deep branches. And you're like, no, do we need that? No, delete. Do we need that? Delete, 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 delete. And then she
That's
wrote
the
the book.
focusing,
Then
right?
she talked it through and she wrote the book. She wrote it out, she spoke it out, and it was a really concise, powerful story. But that all happened, the edit of the book happened in the map because she was a very visual thinker.
Beautiful.
And so if you find tools that fit your mind, if you're a very flaring person, mind mapping can really start with the flare, and then you can start using it to sort of bend those branches into a focus, And there's other tools that are amazing for flare. Taking notes is great for flaring. Just take a note, put it into Apple Notes or Google Keep or something.
Well, and let me just do a call out to what you're creating. You're creating this app, which is now out, Ivy, that's really great because it is a mind mapping tool, but it can just listen to you speak. It mind maps everything. It also gives you the sequence because it will also give you a transcript of everything that you've said. And there are all sorts of other cool features coming down the pike, like it will help to create test questions and stuff like that. And it's such a great tool for really walking you through the steps of flare, filter, focus so that you can stay in flow.
Yeah.
I just have to give you that little bit of a plug because it's quite an extraordinary tool. And I'm advising on this project, so I'm having great fun with this as well. So it's to add another F into it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out because it's a really great way to process ideas. It's a great way to generate ideas, to organize ideas, and to really help with the thinking process. But it honors many different ways of processing at the same time.
Absolutely. And I love integrating these different tools where you can speak out your thoughts, stay in the flow of your thoughts, flow of a conversation. You know that it's being transcribed and you can see it being turned into a map. And then at the end of the conversation, you can actually use the map to kind of edit what you've said. Did we say this? Did we agree this? Are these the main points? So it's a way of double diamonding it, basically. You go
Yeah.
back to it and you say, right, we've got the Lego pieces on this map. Should we just edit this down to what we think are what I call the 7 gold nuggets? What are the 7 things you want to take away from this meeting? Often it's 5 or 4, but often 7 really valuable points.
But, if you've got a little kid that has great ideas, but they're not a good writer, I mean, you could even just, hop onto Ivy with them, the two of you, like a mother or a tutor,
Yes. Yes.
and just ask questions, just interview that child, and it will mind map all of their ideas. And then that's when you can then filter and then focus. And before you know it, they've written something quite extraordinary and it's theirs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
entirely theirs.
Yeah. And it's not an AI who's done like an AI summary of what they think your story
No.
should be or anything like that. It's just like keywords on a map. And really, if anyone else looked at it, they would go, what's this all about? But because you created it along with Ivy, you're like, I know exactly what this outline is of the story. And they go into the second double diamond, or the third double diamond in that case, which is now I'm going to tell the story as speech to text into Google Docs. And then I'm going to go through and edit it. I'm going to put it into paragraphs. I'm going to polish it down, and then it's finished. So it's kind of like this double diamond happens often in different tools as well. And I think Ivy's a really great sort of bridge between what you're thinking and a final tool. So for example, if you wanted to create a PowerPoint presentation, you wouldn't be doing it within Ivy, but you'd map it out in Ivy and then you'd export it to a PowerPoint tool like Google Slides, and you'd put the slides in, add the images in, and you'd have a well-structured slideshow or whatever. So the point I'm trying to make here now is it's really useful with the flare and focus to find tools that help you in those modes.
It
So
helps you to flare and helps you
yes,
to focus.
absolutely. And there are certain things that really help you to focus, like Apple reminders helps you to focus because you've got a list of reminders. You decide what's going to be at the top, right? What am I doing next? I don't need to flare. I just need to go to the top of the list and do that one at the top, and that's it. That's focus. And that helps me focus. And you're like, oh, I want to focus right now. Okay, I'll go to reminders. It'll help me focus. Oh, I want to flare a little bit right now. Let's do a map. Oh, I want to, do you know what I mean? You find a tool as well as a person. So we talked about people you can do it with, but you can also do it with tools.
Well, it's a processing tool.
Yeah,
All of this, everything we're talking about today is about tools to help you process.
yes. And then these two main modes, flaring mode and focusing modes, they are processes. Absolutely. So flare and focus and executive functions. Who'd have known it? But we could have talked about that for a whole hour, but that was good fun talking about that.
It sure was. Until next time.
Till next time.
Sponsored by the Executive Functioning Remedial Assessment, an online tool that quickly identifies challenges and delivers targeted strategies for success.
Sponsored by Ivy. Imagine turning your meeting's audio into a live mind map instantly so you remember what matters. It's ideal for students and managers with dyslexia or ADHD. Try Ivy for free now at ivy.app. That's ivvi.app. Thank you for joining us at the Executive Function Brain Trainer podcast.
Check out our show notes for links and resources and follow us on social media.